Are you still exposing to the right like it's 2012? If you are, well, you're probably losing shots, especially in the dynamic situations we encounter when shooting wildlife or sports. With today's cameras, shadow recovery is incredibly easy and powerful, while blown out highlights, well, they are still gone forever, nothing to do about that. So today, let's talk about why I stopped exposing to the right and why you should do it too. If you're new to the channel, my name is Paolo Sartori. I'm a wildlife and nature photographer from Italy. On this channel, I share tips and tricks and behind the scenes from my trips. If you want to see more of this content, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Quick recap in case you missed the memo back in 2012. What is ETTR? ETTR means exposed to the right, and the idea is very simple. You want to push the histogram as much as you can to the right without touching the edge and therefore without blowing any highlights. This way, it's possible to maximize the amount of light data that we capture with the sensor, especially in the shadow areas where we can record the shadows a bit brighter than they should be, and then we can still bring them back and lower the levels in post-production. Back then, sensors were noisy, the dynamic range was very limited, so the logic was very simple. You should capture as much light as possible in the sensor and get as much good signal as possible, and then, if needed, in post-processing, you would just bring it back and lower the levels, but never ever amplify them. And honestly, it worked. With the cameras we had a decade ago, exposing to the right would give a much cleaner and more workable RAW file. But guess what? It's no longer 2012 and things have changed. Today's cameras like the R5, R3, the Sony A1, the Nikon Z9, they all have incredible dynamic range compared to what we had a decade ago, and the shadow recovery is much easier. With my current setup, I often find myself raising shadows even 3 stops or more, and still the file stays very clean, and it's something that I would have never talked about a few years ago. But blown out highlights, those are still a disaster. If you clip highlights, the data is gone, nothing to do about that. This happened to me during one of my first leopard sightings. I did not realize that the mane of a leopard can be incredibly reflective if hit by direct sunlight. And I have all of this series of photos that are amazing in theory, but the highlights in the mane are blown out and I cannot use them. I cannot do anything about it. Today, exposing to the right is useless. Not only we risk clipping the highlights, but also staying so close to the right side of the histogram without clipping requires constant fine-tuning of the exposure levels, and is something that takes away from the flexibility of the camera automations. Things change very quickly and we have to constantly point the camera in different directions and in dramatically different light conditions. But if I am trying to stay super close to the right side of the histogram, at some point I will just clip the highlights. There is nothing to do about it. So here is my new approach to these situations, especially when we are dealing with super high contrast scenes or very strong sunlight. I intentionally underexpose, sometimes by 2/3 to even one full stop, and this allows me to prevent any highlight clipping. First thing, I set my camera in manual mode with auto ISO. Second, I always enable the histogram to be shown both in the display and in the viewfinder. This way, I always have a histogram preview of my signal. I don't have to take a test shot and look afterwards anymore, like it was with the DSLRs. Third, I aim for a histogram that is bright enough, but far from the right side so that I have some buffer room to make sure I'm not clipping highlights. How do I do that? I do it by acting on the exposure compensation dial. So in all my cameras, I would set this dial here to control the exposure compensation, so I can always adjust the level if I see that the histogram is moving too far on the right side. Also very important, I never judge the exposure based on the preview that I see on the screen, either on the screen or the viewfinder, doesn't matter, but what we see there, it's influenced by a lot of things, including the ambient light. Our eyes might be tricked on thinking that that exposure looks too dark if there is a lot of ambient light, or vice versa, when it's dark, maybe we are taking some night photography, we can look at the screen and think it's very bright and it's a perfect exposure, but actually when we open it in the computer, it's not. So never trust what you see on the screen, trust your histogram. If you find these tips interesting, make sure you download my 100 pages wildlife photography ebook where I explain everything more in detail, including camera settings, gear choice, composition, use of light, and infill techniques. You can find the link down in the description. There is still a scenario where we can use exposing to the right to our advantage, and this is when we are dealing with low light conditions. In fact, low light usually also means a very narrow dynamic range, just because there is no light, so there is no contrast to be created. There are no deep shadows because everything is kind of the same brightness level. Also, we have to raise the ISO a lot, and then the limits of the sensor start showing up. It gets more tricky to raise the brightness of the image in post-production and still get good results. So yes, in this type of situation, we should aim to get as much light as possible to hit our sensor so that we get a good enough signal to result in a usable photo instead of a super noisy file. If you struggle dealing with low light and high ISO scenarios, don't worry, you're not alone. I made a full video where I explain why high ISO are not actually the cause of the noise and what we should do when we are dealing with low light situations. So make sure you go and check it out before your next photo mission.